Chapter 11. Once Gideon and Caleb had explained their predicament to the king, it was decided that the soldiers ought to go more forcibly through the kingdom and take the Asherah poles, chop them down, and burn them in the square. As for the matter of Eli's imprisonment, Joab and a dispatch of soldiers would see to it that he was released. Jeroboam was to be arrested and thrown into his own prison until such a time that he could be tried. Gideon knew that there would be much resistance from the villagers, and he had seen the power of Amon firsthand. How many of the villagers had learned to use this power? He requested that be given 100 soldiers to complete the task of destroying all of the Asherah poles. Solomon reminded everyone that the villagers must give up the poles willingly and not have them taken by force, and though many disagreed, the king himself did not debate this counsel. Thus, Gideon's request for 100 soldiers was denied. "Well, I suppose that with 50 good men we could," Gideon began. "No, not with 50, Melchizedek said. 30? Gideon asked. "Gideon, this task will be for you and Caleb alone." "But, your majesty, the power of Asherah." "Oh, brave little man," the king said affectionately. "There is a greater power in this kingdom. You will see victory." So Gideon and Caleb set about chopping down all the Asherah poles in the village. They began with the one in Gideon's own courtyard, where Gideon himself took an axe to it with great zeal. Once it was down, both Gideon and Caleb felt emboldened to attack the rest. To their surprise, many of those who had erected the poles were happy to see them come down. Even some who had been with Amon earlier that day did not resist, but in fact led the two soldiers to different poles throughout the city. Tobias had ridden Ruah for most of the day. After his break by the stream, there were fewer and fewer animals. Even the howling wolves were no longer heard. The trees themselves grew thinner, as did the air, and there was snow. At first there were mounds of it here and there beside the path, but now they had been running in it for some time. It was about a foot deep in most places, and the uneven ground underneath the snow made treacherous for horse and rider. Nonetheless, Ruah maintained his speed. However, once the sun had begun to set, Ruah slowed to a walk and then stopped. It was snowing by that time. It was evident that Ruah meant to stay the night in that mountain pass. Tobias had not counted on camping and realized that he was unprepared for it. He became suddenly very grateful for the queen's mantle. Whatever fabric it was made of, it seemed wind and waterproof, and it was warm. It was also large enough to cover his whole body. Tobias dismounted from Ruah and carefully began to remove his armor, placing it under the branches of one of the larger trees at that altitude, where it would stay dry. He kept the mantle on, in part for warmth, and in part remembering his promise to the queen that he would not take it off. He then set to work gathering firewood. He did not take the time to tie up Ruah. After all, he'd seen of the horse that day. It seemed that tying it up would be fruitless. He also had a certain respect for the beast, which he felt in some ways was no beast at all. He had remarkably good luck getting a fire going. There was plenty of dry wood under the trees, and if nothing else, he had at least brought some flint in his sack. He sat for a time by the fire while Ruah stood nearby. As evening turned to night, the clouds moved on, and Tobias could see clearly the white mountain top against the black, moonless sky. Tobias ate his meal of bread and wine, and once again found it refreshing. There was no hope of finding the same blue fruit he had had at lunch. He almost wished he had brought some, but soon his thoughts turned to the very practical, the need for sleep. He was quite tired, and the snowy mountaintop offered little comfort. He may be able to clear a spot under a tree where it would be dry, although it would remain cold, hard, and prickly with the needles and sticks. He set about doing this, when his attention was drawn to something high above, screeching as it flew. An eagle? No, it was not an eagle, but rather a dragon. He quickly kicked snow into his fire to extinguish it, and prayed the dragon had not seen it. He crawled into the dry spot under the tree where his sword and armor lay, and pulled the mantle tight around him, covering everything but his eyes. Then he watched and listened. Ruah stood, ears alert, not making a sound. A small plume of smoke arose from the ashes, threatening to betray his location. He found the dragon again on the night sky, and discovered that it was not alone. 6, 7, maybe 8 dragons flew together in formation, heading straight towards the kingdom. At the rate they were going, they'd likely be over the village within a couple of hours. Tobias felt the urge to race them back to the village on Ruah, and yet he knew that he would arrive almost a whole day too late. And besides, he'd come this far to find Sarah and to rescue her. But then he noticed something else. There appeared to be men riding on the backs of the dragons. At that distance he could not precisely make them out, but it appeared that there were several on each dragon's back, and more being carried in the claws of the dragons. There was no way the king could be prepared for this nighttime invasion. Worse yet, Sarah may have been among those riding with the dragons, willingly or unwillingly. The dragons flew off towards the castle, apparently unaware of the young man and his horse watching from the mountaintop below. Tobias was left with a sickening feeling of futility. He did not know the next step. He could not know. His horse had brought him that far, and now the horse was clearly settling in for the night with no intention of going on. Tobias began to feel a sense of despair, and he looked up at the stars and asked the empty sky his question. Why? He watched the sky for some time, looking for an answer. There were no shooting stars that night, no aurora borealis, nothing profound that he could take as a sign, just the constant, staring stars. And yet he suddenly noticed a pattern to the stars themselves, the constellations. They did not make a picture or a sign, but they matched perfectly. And here he had to check repeatedly to be sure. Yes, they matched perfectly with the arrangement of the stars of the queen's mantle. In fact, if one were to wear it as the queen usually did, draped over her shoulders, with the upper part of the mantle would be the north, the lower part the south, and east and west would be indicated by the two sides. Somehow this was impressed upon Tobias as being no mere accident, but rather an indication that the universe itself had a pattern and a reason to it. Tobias was able to sleep that night under the tree, cold and uncomfortable though it was. As for the sense of futility in the queen's mantle, he found a source of hope and a reason to believe. Eli watched as the shadows grew longer. The sun was setting outside, and it became clear that he would spend the night in the prison. Surely the king would send someone to help him. But if not, he had until sundown the next day to get into the castle before the gates were closed. He himself had brought this message. He could not believe that they were on the brink of war, and now he had been betrayed by his own people. He had shackles on his hands and feet, and sat in the dirt in a stone dungeon. The smell was awful. Excrement and urine. There were spiders and likely other things crawling about the dark hole, and all Eli could do was sit and hope and wait for redemption. Eventually it grew dark, and Eli closed his eyes because there was nothing to see anyway. He had not slept long when a strange light disturbed him. He opened his eyes to discover a man wearing golden armor and carrying a shield crimson with a golden cross. His sword hung by his left leg with an ornate gold and crimson handle. Eli recognized the man as Michael, the ancient warrior, and it did not disturb him that the warrior should have been long dead. Neither did it disturb him that he had apparently entered the prison without opening the doors. Michael appeared to be illuminated from the inside as a hot coal is. Golden light did not reflect off his armor, but in fact emanated from him. Eli recognized that he must be dreaming. "Get up," Michael ordered Eli. Eli stood, and the shackles fell from his hands and feet. "Why are you in this prison?" Michael asked. Eli felt guarded. "I was overpowered. The baker used the power of Asherah, and the sheriff had me arrested." "The power of Moriah is greater than the power of Asherah," Michael said. "You must use it. It is by that power that we long ago defeated Asherah and the dragons." "You are a member of the kingdom," he went on. "Every man, woman, and child in the kingdom has been given this power by virtue of being members, but they cannot use it for selfish gain. You must remind them." "Me?" Eli protested. "But I can't convince them of anything. Here I am in prison because of my efforts. What can I do?" "You are the messenger of the king," Michael proclaimed. "As such, your words are his words. If they reject you, they reject the king, and they reject the very power of the kingdom. Do not be afraid to speak to them. Your words will not go wrong. Now, come." The warrior turned and began to lead Eli out of the dungeon. The door swung open in front of him, and there were no guards to prevent their escape. Once outside, Michael turned once more to face Eli. You have been appointed by the king. It is your job to get the people to follow you and to enter into the castle. Do not despair, for there is power here to be certainly victorious. Go. With these words, the ancient warrior disappeared. Eli found himself standing alone in the streets outside the prison. It was dark, and there was a cool breeze blowing. And suddenly Eli realized that he had not been dreaming, but it was real, and he'd been set free from the prison. He immediately set out for the town square. The majority of the villagers were in the square. Caleb and Gideon had succeeded in gathering most of the Asherah poles and throwing them into a pile. However, Amon and Jeroboam had resisted, and now they were convincing others to join in their rebellion. Joab and his men were also there. They had come to arrest Jeroboam, but were afraid to do so when they realized that the whole village was in an uproar, and that Jeroboam had set himself up as a leader of the rebellion. He had under his authority all of the policemen and prison guards, and many of those were armed. Near the center of the square was a raised platform, upon which stood the bronze statue of King Melchizedek on horseback, armed for battle. Jeroboam stood on the platform with his back to the statue. Below him, facing outwards, were Amon, several policemen and guards, and other villagers who had decided to join him. People of Moriah, Jeroboam was shouting, we are not in rebellion against you or against our king. We know that King Melchizedek has in the past been a great leader and warrior. It was our fathers under Melchizedek who defeated the dragons and expanded Moriah to the great extent that we now know our kingdom to be. However, that was then, this is now. Melchizedek is an old man. Most of us do not even remember the ancient battles, and yet he led them. He lives in a palace decorated and built on the taxes that we have dutifully paid all of these years. But we do not live in palaces. He does not know what it is like to live in the village of Moriah. He does not understand our economy. He is weak, and he is afraid of an attack by our long-defeated enemies, an attack that I stand here to assure you will not come. It would be severely damaging to us if we were to go into the castle walls now and allow our fields and our shops to stand untended. We must not obey this king of ours. He is out of touch with the people. He is a mere figurehead, and now is the time to send him that message. We, the people, can decide what is right and what is wrong. We must no longer submit to this puppet dictator. As he said these last words, he looked to Joab. Joab caught the implication. Gideon yelled from the crowd, not listen to him. He's under the influence of Asherah. We must destroy these poles now. But nobody moved to light the poles. Amon said something to Jeroboam. Jeroboam nodded and said, Gideon, you know the power of Asherah. Come here and we'll demonstrate it again. At this, the police and guards and several others began to laugh. They'd clearly heard the stories of what happened to Gideon and Caleb. Jeroboam addressed the crowd again. Let us not fight. Let us all go back to our homes and stop this nonsense about Asherah and dragons. We're not at war. Let us not become at war with one another. Joab, take your men and return to your homes. We do not acknowledge your authority here. Let each man decide for himself what is best. It was clear that the villagers saw Jeroboam as an authority, and yet nobody moved at first. Jeroboam began to climb down from the platform. He would walk right past Joab, and perhaps Amon could once again demonstrate his power, this time on the general. But before he could get down, another voice called out from the crowd. Enough! People of Moriah, listen to me! Jeroboam looked to see who was speaking. To his astonishment, there stood Eli, right in the square. The villagers knew that he had been arrested. What they and Jeroboam wanted to know was how had he been freed. Eli did not climb onto the platform where Jeroboam stood, but instead he addressed the villagers from the ground, where he stood in front of the pile of Asherah poles. It was stacked several feet taller than Eli stood. The battle is coming, and will be upon us this very night, Eli said. We must be united under our king as one people, and fight back as a single body if we are to hope to see victory. Yes, the power of the dragons and the power of Asherah is great, but the power of Moriah is even greater. Eli spoke with authority. No one knew when the battle would begin, and Eli even wondered why he had said that it would begin that night. But there was a burning inside of him, and he continued to speak as he felt inspired. I will now demonstrate to you the power of Moriah, he declared. I call down fire from the heavens to consume these poles. No sooner had he said these things than a great light appeared in the sky above the square. The crowd reeled back as an immense ball of fire fell from the sky and hit the pile. The Asherah poles ignited immediately. After this terrifying spectacle, the crowd left the square in a panic. Those who had rallied around Jeroboam now scattered. Joab's men managed to arrest Jeroboam, who stood pale and shaking in the firelight. Please, he said to Joab, I want to see the king. Chapter 12. After the incident of the burning Asherah poles, Joab and his men had a much easier go at it, persuading the people of Moriah to come together in the castle. It was rumored for a time that they had in fact thrown Jeroboam into the fire, thus turning the whole thing into a great funeral pyre. To dissuade this rumor, Joab had Jeroboam very visibly escorted to the castle, well in view of everyone. Well into the night, the villagers made their way steadily into the castle, lest Eli should feel it necessary to demonstrate his power again. That it was not Eli's power, but the power of Moriah, would have to be established later. As for Eli, he suddenly had the respect and the fear of the people. So emboldened was he after his encounter with Michal that this new respect seemed appropriate. In short, whether by love or fear, people began to obey the king's edict and to gratefully accept his protection. Gideon and Caleb found many more villagers who had Asherah poles. They came more willingly now and had begun to call the things cursed poles. There were some that resisted, however, when confronted with 2 armed guards and the warning that those who do not remove the poles would forfeit their citizenship in Moriah. Even these acquiesced. The one exception to this rule was Amon. He was adamant that they will not deny me the power that is mine. To this effect, he resolved to guard his pole, lest Caleb or Gideon or any other citizen turned zealot would try to deny him his right. In fact, he managed to climb the pole, and having with him a length of rope, fastened himself to its top. Should anyone wish to remove his pole, they would first have to remove him. The king and his queen stood on the balcony within the castle, from which royal proclamations, knightings, and blessings were made. From the balcony, they could look down into the outer court, or look over the walls of the castle and out into and across the village. King Melchizedek himself welcomed his tired citizens as they came slowly through the great arched gateway. Tents were being pitched throughout the courtyard. People began to gather around small fires. Children cried, and many more slept in tents. And still, the people poured in through the castle gates. Not only villagers, but farmers and forestry workers, people from all over the kingdom of Moriah. And now something new stirred the crowd. Jeroboam came in with 2 guards, one on each arm. For a moment he made eye contact with the king, but looked down sheepishly. He had nearly started a rebellion against this man. He knew that he would be thrown into the dungeon, but he knew too that it was better to throw himself upon the king's mercy than to be left outside the walls. As for the king, he left the balcony and came running down the stairs towards Jeroboam. He ran through the crowds, holding up his robes so that he would not trip on them. When he came to where Jeroboam stood, Jeroboam fell to his knees. "Your Majesty," he began, "please forgive your servant." The king lifted the man to his feet and gave him a great bear hug. "Welcome, my son. Come into the palace." Nobody witnessed the conversation between them within the palace, but when he came out, the king gave instructions that Jeroboam had been restored as sheriff and that all citizens were once more bound to obey him. Many of the officers shook Jeroboam's hand and congratulated him. Many of the soldiers shook their heads and mumbled to themselves, but all obeyed the king. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the gates. The steady flow of people had turned into a stampede. "Monsters! Monsters!" they cried. Throughout the village, people had seen horrible monsters, leathery, wilted, all claws and fangs and red-eyed creatures, green and gray and black. And here was a man whose arm was bleeding from an encounter with one. Here was another, carrying a woman slung over his shoulder as she screamed hysterically, "My daughter! My daughter!" "The battle has begun," the king declared. Guards on the walls readied their arrows, while Jeroboam and his officers drew swords and ran back out into the village. Reuben had 5 guards posted at the castle gate to ensure that humans and no monsters could enter. One of the guards began lowering the heavy metal gate, but Reuben ran to the man and made him reopen it. "They say the village is full of mazakim," the guard protested. "The king desires that all might be saved," Reuben answered. Out in the village, the call went out, "Every man, arm yourself!" Joab's men captured one of the creatures. Though it was only about 5 feet tall, it was remarkably strong and agile. It writhed and lashed with its teeth and claws. But they were able to hold it at bay with ropes around its neck and 4 sword points directed at it. Joab took one look at the creature. "Kill it," he said. "Kill them all." Every man in the village and many of the women were instructed to take up arms, shovels and knives and axes and pitchforks. They would defend their kingdom. Now every woman, child, and elderly person was being herded into the castle. None resisted any more. Eli found himself surrounded by the creatures. 3 of them, now 4 of them. They began to circle him, grinning, barking, and howling like dogs, laughing like hyenas. Their black, leathery tongues darted in and out. One of them looked Eli straight in the eyes, a big, open-mouthed grin on its horrible face. But the expression on its face suddenly changed as Eli met its gaze and stared back. It let out a frightened yelp and said in a whispered shriek, "I know who you are!" Then it ran. The others ran as well, leaving Eli alone in the dark streets. From his position on top of the Asherah pole, Amon could see that something was happening throughout the village. Gideon and Caleb had left him alone for some time, and he began to find it cold and uncomfortable atop the pole. He considered whether he ought to come down and investigate what all the commotion was about. Suddenly, a strange animal landed on a rooftop near him. It was breathing heavily and had bat-like wings, although it flew more like a chicken, in short, sporadic flights. It looked hungrily at the man on the pole. Shaking, Amon began to loosen his bonds, but it was too late. The creature, jaws wide open, had pounced. Tobias woke up cold and stiff the next morning. The sun had just begun to rise, and Ruah roused Tobias by gently nudging him. Groggily, he got up, yet he was too tired to build a fire or make breakfast. And besides, Ruah was pawing at the ground, anxious to get going. So, after some quick stretches to try to soothe the pain in his back and legs, and after he had gathered his belongings and put on his armor, Tobias once more mounted the stallion. No sooner had he done so than they were off, quickly regaining the speed they had had the day before. Tobias forced himself to keep alert, though he had not slept well. He thought of Sarah in the clutches of a dragon and remembered the task that lay ahead. They began to descend on the far side of the mountain. Tobias knew that he was beyond the boundaries of Moriah now, that he had moved into the wasteland. He had long heard that the wasteland was inhabited by exiles and thieves who could not or would not live in the kingdom. It was cold there, at least that morning. Few trees grew, and the ground was rocky and dirty. Though it was still mountainous, the mountains did not have the same beauty on this side as they had on the other. Perhaps it was because the mountains no longer contrasted with a thick forest. Instead, all was gray and brown, stone and dirt. They had not traveled long when Ruah slowed to a trot. His ears were perked, and he moved more cautiously now. Tobias, too, grew more alert. Eventually they came to a place where Ruah began acting even more agitated and seemed to deliberately draw Tobias's attention to the ground in front of them. There were claw marks in the ground and scratches, much like he had seen in Sarah's garden, and lingering in the air, that certain smell. The marks led to a cave, and it was clear the dragon had gone in. But was it the same dragon? Ruah seemed prepared to move on, possibly even afraid of the dragon. But how could a horse know that this was the very thing they had come to confront? Tobias did what he could to slow Ruah, Without reins, all he could do was pull the stallion's mane. Rua jerked his head back and stumbled, but did not stop. However, he was moving cautiously enough now that Tobias was able to slip off his back and land on his feet behind the horse. Rua looked at Tobias, his eyes clearly detailing some sort of danger, his head movements sharp and jerky as if to say, "Get back on my back, you fool! This is no place for us. There's a dragon nearby." "Wait," Tobias ordered the horse. Rua stomped his hoof impatiently. It was clear that Rua was not accustomed to taking orders. "Wait," Tobias told him again. Tobias moved slowly, carefully, nearer the mouth of the cave. He could not see into the cave, and he realized that the dragon may be just inside, waiting to pounce. He held up his shield and his sword and wrapped his mantle tight. Then he noticed something on the ground. Amongst the scratches and the claw prints on the ground, there was a human footprint. Just one, small, bare, about the size that would have been created by Sarah's foot. So he had found where she was hidden. Tobias knew that he would be in great danger, yet he resolved that he ought to go into the cave and rescue her. Tobias quickly fashioned a torch out of a stick with some dried grass. He leaned his head in near the mouth of the cave, helmet on, shield in front, sword drawn. He heard only a quiet, muffled crying sound from somewhere deep inside the cave. "Hello?" he called. The crying stopped. Tobias listened carefully to hear if something were moving towards him, but there was no movement. He tried again. "Hello?" This time a voice called back. "Tobias?" It was Sarah. Her voice sounded broken and quiet, like she'd suffered much and cried much over the last few days. Now Tobias leaned further into the cave. "Are you alone?" "Yes," she called back. "Please, hurry. The dragon will be back soon." Tobias grabbed the flint from his bag and lit his makeshift torch. He'd never made a torch before, but this one seemed to work well. "I'm coming." He stepped into the cave. The torchlight was able to make out that the cave narrowed considerably after a few feet. He could stand, but just barely, and he'd have to inch sideways through the passage. Shield in one hand, torch in the other, sword back in its sheath. Because of the narrowness of the passage, his shield had to go first, turned at an angle. The torch was behind him, and so his own shadow made it difficult for him to see. He stumbled a bit and hit his head on rocks jutting out from the walls. Here the passage grew shorter, and he had to go on all fours, which proved quite difficult in armor, with his shield and torch in hand. He had to crawl, dragging his shield, with only the torch hand in the air. Then the torch went out. He found himself in total darkness. He looked back towards the entrance, but because the cave had twisted and turned, he could no longer see it. "Please, hurry," Sarah begged. Tobias pushed on, dragging his shield, groping in the darkness. The rocks here were wet, dripping with some muddy, slimy substance. And the smell. The dragon smell grew stronger now. Tobias wondered if the dragon got its smell from the mud, or if the mud got its smell from the dragon. Suddenly, the floor dropped out in front of him. He almost fell headlong into a chasm. He found a pebble, which he dropped into the hole in front of him, and he counted. 1, 2, 3, before he heard it crack on the sound of rock below. So he knew that it was deep, whereas the voice seemed to come from straight ahead. "How does a dragon even get through here?" he muttered to himself. In total darkness, relying only on his sense of hearing, he had to assume that the cave went on straight ahead beyond this hole. He groped above for the roof but could not find it. Thus he knew that he could stand. The cave remained narrow enough that he could wedge himself with his back on one wall and his feet on the other and slowly inch his way over the hole which had opened beneath him. Again, this proved to be a great difficulty to a man fully armed. He considered leaving the shield and possibly the sword behind, but realized that the king had said he would need the full armor, and he dared not. He could feel the mud trickling down his neck and back, right under his armor. He hated to think about how he was dirtying the golden armor or the beautiful mantle of the queen. But more important than any of these thoughts was the one that pushed him on. Sarah was trapped somewhere in this cave, and he must find her. Finally, he felt with his foot that he was past the hole, and that the ground was dry and fairly flat. The passage was also taller and wider here. He moved much more easily now, but cautiously, as he still could not see. Then ahead he saw a dim whitish light. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but it was true light. Tobias forgot his earlier caution now and nearly ran into the chamber at the end of the tunnel. It was lit by an opening a little above and to the left, which opened right to the outdoors. There on the floor, in the middle of the chamber, was the figure of Sarah, wearing white and doubled over. She was still crying. Tobias ran to her and placed his hands on her back. "Sarah," he said. The woman turned and looked at him, but it was not Sarah. Her hair was a very artificial blonde. Her face was blotchy from where tears had smudged her black eye paint. She continued to make her crying sounds, but she had a distorted grin on her face and moved close to Tobias. She had bags under her eyes and looked as though she were about 50 years old, trying to look 18. "My hero," she said in her exaggeratedly high-pitched voice, the one she had used to lure him in. Then, before he could respond, she grabbed his head and kissed the stunned Tobias full on the mouth. Her lips were waxed and sticky and tasted like honey and tobacco. He pushed her away from himself and put his hand to his sword. "Back off, woman, or I will run you through with my sword." She laughed but did not back away. "You will treat me better when I'm your queen," she said. "Molech, he's your prisoner." Then she left the cave, taking a simple inclined path towards the light. But as she left, Tobias noticed that they had not been alone in the cave. There, between him and the light of the exit, was a great black dragon.